Right. My name is Kaitlyn Molloy, and I am the Public Policy Counsel for the Southern Center for Human Rights, and a member of the Justice Reform Partnership almost since it was founded. We are happy. I'm happy to be here today to moderate our first panel on front-end matters. So the financial impact of the criminal legal system is felt deeply even at the earliest stages of the system, before a person is even arrested. When we look at the police presence in certain communities, access to various resources, and from the moment of that first encounter, your access to wealth can dictate what's going to happen to you. A person's access to financial resources or lack thereof can mean the difference between freedom and incarceration, and in the worst cases, of course, can mean the difference between life and death. Money can dictate whether you encounter the criminal legal system at all, and certainly can dictate what outcomes you experience once you are in the criminal legal system. I'm joined today by a panel of experts. When we think about those front-end issues, there are all kinds of topics we could focus on. We only have a little bit of time this morning, so we're going to talk a bit about housing and pretrial detention and bail, and workforce matters. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to, in turn, introduce yourselves and let us know what brings you to this conversation today. Luci, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. It's great to see you all today. I'm glad to be here. My name is Luci, Harrell. Right now I'm doing a Soros Justice Fellowship project on decriminalizing poverty in Atlanta. You know, we have I'm not going to go into that right now. We have the highest rising poverty rate in the nation in Atlanta, and that's very important work. I'm doing it through the support of the Policing Alternatives and Diversion Initiative here in Atlanta, or PAD.
Thanks, Luci. Ray?
Yes, I'm Ray Khalfani, Senior Analyst with the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. I handle our workers' justice and criminal legal system work. And often I try to look at the intersect that happens when you think about workforce barriers in the criminal legal system. So Georgia is one of the worst states in the country when you think about fines and fees abuses and the barriers that creates. And we talk about workforce shortages so much, we don't talk about the abundance of barriers that actually create them and perpetuate them. So that's my space in this.
Thanks, Ray. And Becky?
Hi, I'm Becky Hudock. I'm Senior Policy Counsel for Georgia Appleseed. So Georgia Appleseed is an organization that advocates on behalf of Georgia's children in the two places where children are the most, so in schools and at home. Georgia Appleseed started in 2005 talking about school climate and school discipline issues, and we realized that kids cannot thrive in school if they come from unstable homes and unhealthy homes. And so I head up the housing justice initiatives for Georgia Appleseed.
Thank you. All right, we'll get started. Luci, in your experience and in your research, how have you seen the impact of people's socioeconomic status on the outcomes they can expect in the criminal legal system?
Yeah, so what's going on in Atlanta is that people who are living in poverty, and especially people who are living in extreme poverty, are being super over-criminalized. Like I said, I brought some stats with me, just some preliminary stuff that I'm finding. But I do want to speak to the fact that people who live in poverty are criminalized for things that people who are not living in poverty are not. And that's a big problem. And when we talk about offenses that show up in city court, a lot of times, you can call them, people give them terms that I don't typically like to use, like low level or, petty offenses and things like that. But we're really talking about things that have to do with quality of life issues. People just simply trying to survive, people being criminalized for being, just for being in the city, and I think your colleague on Monday at City Council, Devin, said, Atlanta hates poor people, and that is something that we know. We see that play out in municipal court every day. So I just want to give you a few stats. So the poverty rate in the U.S. is 12.8%, and in Georgia it's 14%, but in Atlanta our poverty rate is 18.5%. So just to put that into context, we have 2.4% of Atlantans living on the streets. But when we think about arrests and citations through City of Atlanta Municipal Court, 12.5% of people are living on the streets who are being arrested and cited. So just think about that. There's no way to project how many of those people are actually living in poverty, but if we did a comparison analysis, I suspect we're well over 80% of people who are being criminalized are living in poverty with that high of a rate. And as our guest speaker so eloquently laid out, Black and brown people are most negatively affected by this. 78% of people who are getting cited and arrested in the city of Atlanta are Black, are African American. 89% of trans folks who are getting arrested and cited in Atlanta are Black. And those are just stark realities that PAD and Partners for Home and other organizations who are trying to assist people with basic needs who are out here living on the streets in our communities are dealing with. So I just wanted to draw those things out.
Yeah, thanks for really setting the stage for this conversation. I think we'll dive down into some particular issues now that you already have laid out. Becky, the issue of housing access and unsheltered homelessness in particular has gained much greater attention among state lawmakers in recent years, for better or worse. And unfortunately, proposed solutions to unsheltered homelessness have relied too much on criminal legal responses, an approach that ignores the high risk that we just heard that folks already who are experiencing homelessness already sort of face a high risk of arrest. So describe for us the ways that housing and the criminal legal system intersect now.
So I guess to build on what Luci says, like why we're seeing so many people in the street is because it's increasingly difficult to find affordable housing, not only in Atlanta, but in the state of Georgia. A huge amount of our population is rent burdened, meaning they spend over 30% of their income on housing, and things can't keep up. Minimum wage is only $7.25 in Georgia. You would have to work 116 hours just to afford a modest two-bedroom home in the metro area. And so ultimately, obviously on the very, very front end, the more people that cannot afford stable housing, the more people you're going to just be living on the street. Of course, there are long-term effects and how it intersects with housing, but number one, not being able to afford it is pushing people out onto the streets.
And once someone has been arrested, how does homelessness affect their ability to escape the criminal legal system? And maybe, what about access to mental health services, things like that?
So escaping the criminal justice system. So this is more of my experience as a 16-year public defender, but any person that has gone into a courtroom or sat with a friend or experienced bond hearings, sentencing hearings, probation violation hearings, the threshold consideration is where is this person in front of me going to live, right? And so as a public defender trying to argue for bond that you should release this person to the community, you need an address. And good luck and God bless to the social workers and the community partners that are trying to find homes for these people. It's incredibly challenging. When you're talking about sentencing mitigation, and you're left between the option of, is this person going to be incarcerated or can they be safely released to the community? They want to know what that community is, and that's a solid, safe address where relationships can be established, where they can raise their families, where they can be safe. And then certainly probation violations. It's the same thing. As much as people want to be housed safely and stably, the system wants it even more, but unfortunately provides few supports to make sure that that actually happens.
Thanks for sharing all of that. So Ray, some policymakers who recognize the problem of mass incarceration believe that criminal penalties that rely only on fines are a sort of better alternative to a prison sentence. What is the harm in imposing fines as criminal penalties?
Well, I'll start by saying that, fines and fees in themselves, that's imprisonment in itself. Fines and fees, can be an imprisonment, being able to get health care, can imprison you from getting health care. It's economic imprisonment, it's social imprisonment. While in the state of Georgia, it's not, people who have to pay fines, who owe fines and fees, they're still able to vote. It still effectively keeps them out of that process, because a lot of people try to avoid any type of contact with any part of the system. That way, they can try to avoid all of these crippling fines and fees that they have. So when you think about Georgians who are either at or below the economic margins, so many of them are in a place where they're in impossible situations to be able to get out of the fines and fees type of traps that they're being put in, and being forced to make impossible imprisoning choices in that. So Georgia is a place, is a state that criminalizes the inability to pay fines and fees. So for those who on those margins can't pay them, they face a system that is looking to incentivize them to put them into. I mean, for one, you're placed on probation in so many places across the state if you're not able to pay your fines and fees up front, and that means that's constant check-ins under a probation system, oftentimes a private probation system. That's incentivized on keeping you under probation for as long as possible, getting as many fines, fees on top of the fines you owe from you as much as possible, placing fees on you which oftentimes have nothing to do with the offense that you've been placed under when it comes to that. So you can be placed on electronic monitoring devices. That's a form of imprisonment that you have to pay for. Weekly, monthly. You can be placed on a drug program that you have to pay for, either weekly or monthly. And other program fees that's part of the crippling system of fines and fees that can keep you in a spiral of economic decline that so many have a problem in getting out of. So when you think about those who are in that space, this is where they have to, instead of paying for the basic necessities that that can keep them and their family going. When you think about housing, when you think about food, water, utilities, the resources that you need to get back and forth from a job and everything else in between, people have to make these impossible choices just to pay fines and fees to do that. So having a system that's incentivized on keeping people in that's incentivized in profiting off of a criminal legal system entanglement through fines and fees, I mean, it's something that certainly is a prison in itself. That, and a lot of you've had some people even say, hey, some people who've gotten off of parole and face that same thing think that being physically in prison is maybe in some ways better than having to face all the fines and fees that await them, when they leave physical incarceration.
And can I just add about the fines and fees too? And it's something that we don't think of as much, but those unpaid fines and fees can get reported and can show up on your credit score. Mm-hmm. And so anybody that has looked to find an apartment, to apply for an apartment, that credit score is one of the preliminary questions that they're going to ask. And so the lower your credit score because of unpaid fines and fees, the less likely, again, that you are to be able to find stable housing.
Yeah, I think in the conversations we had in preparing for the panel, we just talked so much about how interconnected all of these issues are, and the only way to talk about this is to talk about it in discussion with each other, because they all impact each other. And
it's the same thing when it comes to finding a job. I mean, you can be placed on probation for not being able to pay. You could lose the job you have. It could certainly affect the job prospects that you have for future jobs that you seek as well.
Right. Yep. So what's the biggest challenge for stakeholders who want to minimize the use of fines and fees in the criminal legal system?
Well, I mean, when you think about stakeholders, you think about DAs, you think about judges, you think about police officers, you think about probation officers. For those who may want to minimize the use, they're fighting an uphill battle against a system that is incentivizing them to maximize, the assessment and the collection of fines and fees. So, you could lose your job for not, assessing fines and fees or collecting that revenue, as much as, your city or your county or the state may want you to. Or you can certainly just, face, a horrible job environment if you choose not to go along with the tide of the system. So for those, who want to do that within the system, I mean, it's almost like good luck. I mean, that's really almost, unless we change the system altogether or we get rid of a fines and fees system, altogether, trying to fight an uphill battle against a system that, incentivizes the maximization of fines and fees and collecting revenue from people's criminal legal system entanglement. I mean, it's an almost impossible task.
Yeah. So, Luci, there's been recognition by cities across Georgia and across the country that the use of cash bail is punitive and unfair for people, especially for people who lack financial resources. While local organizers have been successful in reforming the bail system in certain communities, Georgia has increasingly expanded at the state level mandatory cash bail. Why is cash bail so harmful?
Cash bail, look, let's first of all acknowledge this. Atlanta has been going through this, insane gentrification over the past several years. And what we see is that as the median household income goes up, our poverty level goes up, right? But what we also see that's happening is that as those two things rise, so do these initiatives to, get more money and impose more cash bail kind of situations on folks who just simply cannot afford to buy their freedom, right? We know from the ACLU report and other reports that the people who are sitting in Fulton County, largely pre-trial, are just sitting there because they happen to be poor and they cannot afford to pay for the door to be open for them. So that is a huge problem. I will say one thing. When I started thinking about this project on decriminalizing poverty, one of the reasons is because I realized that disproportionately the people who are living in extreme poverty and experiencing homelessness that we were advocating for at PAD were having all these open cases from 10, 20, 25 years ago. Some of them just being open because a $50, $100 fee was attached. These are things that come about because of that recriminalization. And then probably the most stark thing that I realized is that people were being arrested for FTA bench warrants for non-arrestable offenses. Let me say that again. People were going to jail because they had bench warrants for failing to appear for non-arrestable citations just because they didn't have an address. They couldn't get the notice that they needed to come to court. So when we talk about all these sorts of cash bail legislations, we are talking about increasing those penalties, and we're talking about incredibly disproportionately that affecting people who are living unsheltered or who are in unstable housing situations on that brink. Those are things that are going to push people over, and so that is how, those people are just almost always going to be affected.
We're going to talk in the next panel about, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into cash bail in the next panel because there is legislation pending to expand mandatory cash bail even further. And so we'll get more into that next. But I wanted to ask, as we are starting to wrap up, wanted to ask, you mentioned FTAs, the failures to appear, right? And this is ostensibly a big concern among lawmakers, right? That we've got these sort of out of control failure to appear rates, and that's why we need to increase cash bail. What have you learned about failures to appear in your work that you want to share with us?
Well, I will say one thing. First of all, there's like this false narrative that people are bail jumping, okay? We use that term, we see that term used by legislators. That is nonsense when we're talking about people who are living in poverty, okay? We are, by and large, talking about people who legitimately don't know that they have a hearing coming up. And it could be for something simple like pedestrian in the roadway, okay? These are real citations that are getting people arrested over and over, and that are just leading to them having outstanding failure to appear warrants in municipal court, like all the time. There's one other thing I wanted to say, though, Kaitlyn. I don't know if many people know this, but during COVID in 2020, City of Atlanta Municipal Court at one point decided that they wouldn't be able to house everybody potentially who could be arrested in ACDC, Atlanta City Detention Center. So what they did is at one point in time in March, one day in 2020, they released all the FTA bench warrants that were in the court system, okay? But then later, they reinstated all those warrants. So what does that mean for you if you happen to check at a certain time to see if you have a bench warrant outstanding and you don't? And then at a later date you do, but you're not notified of that. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, I think we are constantly trying to tell lawmakers that if you're really concerned about people not showing up to court, that they're not showing up to, if someone is not showing up to court, it isn't because they are trying to, evade the consequences of their actions or the consequences that the system is trying to impose on them, it is because they didn't get a piece of mail. It's because they couldn't read the handwritten traffic citation, which was the only notice that they got. It's because, something came up that meant that they could not get there, and the judge gave them no leniency for being late. There are all of these things outside of someone's control that are not just might, but that's usually the explanation for why someone has not shown up. And cash bail is not going to resolve any of those issues, right?
And I will just say, not just in Atlanta, but I think in most municipalities, people want to take care of those citations. They want to have that stuff off their record, just like what Ray was talking about. This stuff comes back to haunt people, and they want to get it taken care of, and it doesn't usually warrant any kind of incarceration if they can do that. But they just simply don't know, right? So when we talk about levying some penalties to people for failing to appear, these are the specific people that we're talking about.
And I think the last thing that we can say as we wrap up this portion of the conversation that I just wanted to add to this point, and another sort of myth about cash bail and this question of failure to appear. We hear from lawmakers and the media all the time about people that they want us to be afraid of who have been released on bail and did something terrible, and that if the cash bail had been higher or whatever the reason is, that this would not have happened. And that is not borne out in the data, which tells us that the higher the penalty is that you are facing, the more likely it is that you are going to appear, right? The harsher the consequences, the higher the stakes, the more likely it is that you're going to appear. So it is in fact the folks who are just facing basic traffic violations who are the most likely to not show up, right? So we are going to be told again and again by the powers that be that this is a public safety question, and it's our responsibility to keep asking those questions and pushing back. We're going to start wrapping up, so a final question for everyone. The final question is, what can state lawmakers do to reduce the criminalization of poverty at the front end of the criminal legal system? And I have not instructed y'all which order we'll go in, so I'll let someone volunteer, whoever's ready.
I'll volunteer. The
Great.
first thing I'll just say, stop, adding to the layers of, the criminalization of poverty that we already have. We on this session here, we're trying to layer that in so many different ways. We're trying to place more, they're trying to put speeding cameras in school zones to try to expand, the web of fines and fees that are already, pervasive in the state. We talked about the issues when it comes to cash bail and how that just widens that web and that trap that people who are already, who've been caught into, fines and fees, caught into a system for being unable to pay fines and fees have faced. So, as we keep layering on to that, that's the first thing to do when we think about how to stop it on the front end. We have to start layering on top of it and how to pull that back, and certainly, have a state that does not rely upon fines and fees to be able to operate and to fund its government.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's right. I think, when people are invested in their communities, when people are brought into the community, they contribute to it and they become an asset. And when we push people out to the fringes, then we have all of these economic problems, and we're not going to solve them by continuing to push people out to the fringes. The thing about FTA warrants is that they also come with a fine. Just like Ray talked about, we come out of prison and then we have fines and fees, and it's like, what is the punishment? What are we doing here? Are we doing this or are we doing this? Do we care about stabilizing the economy? Do we care about people being a part of that and being a part of their communities or not? So I think that's the question that we have to ask ourselves.
Yeah, I would say appropriate more money. The state needs to appropriate more money to address homelessness. $3 million is not enough. The state is like drowning in extra cash that we're trying to give back to folks, but appropriate that money to assist homeless services. And also enact some legislation that protects tenants. If people are housed, protect them, maintain that, prioritize that so people can remain housed and not be forced out onto the streets.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Any last thoughts, Lucy? Seems like you wanted to.
I'm all right.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We'll give our panelists.